He followed them and arrived at a small station where another group of orange people took his ticket and gave him a bracelet around the wrist in exchange. One of them handed him a small booklet and a plastic bag and said, "Enjoy." Sid took a look at the plan that was printed on the back of the schedule and began to walk down the paths that all bore the names of communist figureheads. He was overcome by a terrible sense of indecision. Unable to make up his mind, he wandered through the towns of tents and caravans that stretched out all around. He needed to find some kind of shelter, he told himself, and began to look for a tree. His search took him across the entire area, but even though he began to sweat and his back began to hurt from the weight it had to carry, he did not give up until he finally found a place beneath a small pine where he erected his tent. He set up his things inside, sat down in its entrance, and got out his pipe. After taking a small drag, he leaned back and looked up at the translucent rectangle in the ceiling above him. Through it, he could see the branches of the tree that shielded him off from the sky that was still cloudy and gray. He got out his little black book and began to write. This window into the outside world. Today, it shows a tree. It means home for me, the homeless traveler who does everything to flee. I also see the promise of a never-changing neighborhood that's waiting to be explored. Whatever I will find, I will write. And I know it will be good for my restless, haunted mind. Sid got up and opened the fabric doors of his tent, like so many times before, in order to walk out towards the gates that lay before him. But before he closed the tent behind himself, he took up the mask he had brought along to disguise himself in order to be safe from any vultures that might inhabit the air of these parts of the world. His plan was ingenious. They would not pursue him if he looked like a bird himself. He put on the black bird's face he had made with Juan for a short film and began his journey. His precaution had not been in vain, because after just a few steps, he encountered a giant, white, winged creature that hovered in the air beside him and gave off a soft glow. Sid ducked beneath his hood anyways. But when he approached it, he realized that it was just a firefly, although admittedly, a gigantic one. He passed a big yellow teepee and walked onto a meadow filled with tents and baldachins. When he approached a big tent at the other side, a song reached his ear, and as he recognized it, he let out the hissing croak he had developed for his character in the short film. He noticed how a few bystanders turned around in shock over his animalistic behavior and appearance. Sid raised his fist and continued his journey as he thought to himself, "Freak power." He walked out onto another meadow and sat down in front of a giant wooden wheel where he got out his little black book. Death walks among us, and yet we laugh, because he is locked on a boat behind bars, and makes us believe that we are the ones who pull the strings. Sid was ripped out of his thoughts by the sound of a bell, and when he looked up, he stared into the empty eye sockets of his skeleton. He walked over to a nearby rope and pulled it. An old British man appeared next to him and explained that they needed to work together in order to set the wheel in motion and make an animated film, melting all the skeletons that were attached to the wheel into one that moved. But Sid soon gave up, since he realized, some time ago already, that he did not possess the necessary social skills in order to make a movie. He walked up to the foot of a mountain, which he began to ascend. At its peak, he sat down next to a metal rocket someone had erected here and labeled "Symbol." He looked out past a sea of tents and caravans into the woods that surrounded them, and in which he used to roam around with his grandfather, telling him,
"You know, not everything used to be bad back in the East. Some things are better now, but a lot of things are worse."
But by now, he seemed to have fallen victim to another belief system that seemed like the complete opposite at first glance. If you turn left long enough, you'll end up back on the right eventually, Sid thought, as he looked at the plan of the short-term town they had erected on the air base his great-grandfather had apparently served on for some time. The face of Lenin stared back at Sid, although his eyes were covered by Cyrillic letters. He folded the plan open and tried to locate himself within the Soviet names. But soon he gave up and just walked on down the path at the other side of the hill. He walked through a gate of books and towards the tent that lay behind it, where a couple of Asian musicians intoxicated the crowd before them with sounds from their strange wooden instruments. When the song ended, Sid strolled through the Orient a little while longer, until he found a small winding tower that housed a library. Sid looked up at the bookshelf, and the title called his attention. "No Man is an Island." He sat down and got out his little black book. Shall I read yet another author, trying to convince me that I would not be better off alone? The last ones have failed miserably, and I can't see why this one should be any different. He opened the book anyway, and when he had just begun to read a chapter full of legal jargon, the girl to his right suddenly started to talk to him and asked what he had picked. Sid showed her the book, and when she asked whether he knew the author, he said, "Not really, but the title just jumped at me. It's out of a poem Hemingway based the book on as well. You know about a boy? It's also in that film, I think. Yeah, actually, I read that book and For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway back to back in order to compare what the two had to say about isolation and connectivity. The results were somewhat inconclusive." Sid remembered how much the ending of the first book had upset him, which seemed to claim that all was well since the main characters acted appropriate to their age now, and no longer sang out loud in public, involuntarily, for example. He had not finished For Whom the Bell Tolls, since it had disappeared somewhere in the depths of his room one day, and he would probably not read the end of this book either. A guy to his right suddenly offered him a glass of absinthe, and Sid thankingly took a sip. Before he turned back to the young man, he pulled down his mask